When it comes to the best three-point shooters of 2018, I don't think three-point percentage is the end-all be-all, because if that was the case, Jason Tatum would be very high on this list, and as a Celtics fan, I would love to praise Tatum all the time, but he's only attempting about 3 threes a game. So while it's still impressive what he's doing, there are some guys who are taking 2 to 3 times as many three-pointers as he is a game, and I think they're more deserving of being here than he is. We should also talk about someone like Nikola Mirotic, who has been fantastic from outside in the games that he's played, but he's played less than 20 games this season. That's a pretty small sample size, and as a result, I think it's kind of difficult for him to be here as well. Some things to make note of. So now, with all that, we begin at number 5, and number 5 is Paul George, who is kind of a godsend for the OKC Thunder, because while Carmelo Anthony had to kind of warm up to the off-ball role, and he's accepted it lately, Paul George was ready to do it from day one with this team. 7.5 three-pointers a game, and, well, attempted, I should say, and he's shooting 43% from out there, and he's so good at playing off of Westbrook. He's so good at coming off of screens, or even if he doesn't have a screen, but he's able to just force his defender to stop and go, if you will, and George only needs a little bit of daylight. It helps him that he's one of the taller wings in the NBA and he has a pretty high release on top of it. And I think this is why Paul George is such a versatile offensive player, is that you could put him on pretty much any team in the NBA, and because of this outside shot and how fluid he is in getting to this jumper, I mean, he could play with anybody. I think that was the consensus when he was acquired by the OKC Thunder was, well, it might take a minute, but we think Paul George is going to be good to go from day one, and that's definitely the case. Now, the reason he's number 5 is because I think there are some guys here who do a bit more in terms of off-the-dribble three-pointers, pull-up three-pointers off of pick and rolls and things like that. And that's one thing that I do consider with this is degree of difficulty, but that doesn't stop the fact that PG is very effective, and the Thunder don't even call his number all the time. He's just so good at getting open, I guess. Now, there are floppy sets they run and things like that, but, you know, sometimes PG he kind of has some Richard Hamilton in him with his abilities to just find the open spot on the floor. Now, for number 4, we have the guy who may be the best at that in the NBA, and that would be Klay Thompson. You know what's weird? Klay Thompson is having a great shooting season even by his standards. He's been a little better, as his 7.5 threes a game are actually slightly down from the past 2 seasons. His percentage is through the roof though. 45% from 3. I mean, Klay is quietly not too far off from a 50-40-90 season right now. He's shooting 48% from the field and 89% from the free throw line. I mean, Klay, he could be, in terms of guys who, when they get hot and they just can't miss, he might be the best in the NBA in this regard. Similar to Paul George, the high release and the extremely fast release make it to where, even if you've got a hand in his face, doesn't really matter that much. And I mentioned how Paul George has some Richard Hamilton in him. Klay has pretty much mastered the ability of getting open. The Warriors run an offense where there's just constant movement. He sets a screen for one guy, and then someone else will set a screen for him, and it can lead to open shots, or it could just lead to a smaller defender on him, and like I mentioned before, it's very difficult to contest his shot. So that all helps, but still, he shows a great ability of just finding the right spot on the floor. He does have some ability of creating his own jumpers sometimes. I think his ball handling has become a little underrated. You know, some step backs and sometimes pull-up threes in transition and occasionally off of a pick and roll. I mean, there are some guys here who are just elite when it comes to creating their own three-pointers, and I think Klay has room for improvement there. But I think he's good enough on top of just how good he is at just finding the little seam in order to get his shot off to where it edges him out over Paul George just a little bit. He's also played 3 more games than Paul George has on the season, which I do consider to be a little bit of a push. But now we got to get to Lou Williams, who I actually would consider above Klay Thompson this season. Now, in terms of attempts per game as well as percentage, he's basically right where Klay and Paul George are, over 7 a game, over 40% from 3. The difference with Lou Williams is the degree of difficulty. The majority of Lou's threes seem like they come off of him beating a guy off of the dribble, him pulling up in a pick and roll setting. I mean, he does have a lot of Steph Curry to his three-point shooting, and given the season that Lou is having here for the Clippers, we've basically reached peak Lou Williams. I mean, absolute peak Lou was the game against the Warriors where he puts up 50 points and he gets the 50th point on an irrelevant shot with like 10 seconds left to go in the game. You can't get any more Lou Williams than that. To give you some of Lou's pull-up numbers, he averages about 4 pull-up 3 attempts a game, where he shoots 43%, so dude is super comfortable. Guy in his face, a big man backing up off of a pick and roll because they're terrified of him driving past him. Maybe he'll just hit you with a crossover like he did against the Atlanta Hawks right there. Whatever it may be, Lou's hoisting it up there, and they are dropping at an alarming rate this season. There was the three-pointer I was talking about earlier. All-time confidence for Lou. There's a chance that he could potentially be traded from the Clippers. I don't know at this point because he's really fueled LA not falling apart to the point where they could probably contend for the bottom of the Western Conference playoffs. And if that allows us to see Lou with the ultimate green light for the rest of the season, then I am all for that one. So he edges out Paul George and Klay Thompson because of his ability to create his own threes. Now we got to get to a couple of guys who, honorable mentions if you will. Wayne Ellington, who to me is building a second NBA career for himself past 30 years old. There is JJ Redick, who, doesn't surprise anyone when he's up here. A consistent member of a group like this one. Kyle Korver, who you can also slot in there. Not exactly shocked to see those two on the list. We also have Kyle Lowry, who is also one of the best pull-up three-point shooters in the NBA. Robert Covington, who is finally getting some open looks after having to force a few up in Philadelphia for a while, and Tobias Harris has been fantastic this season as well. Now time for number 2 and number 1. Oh look, it's Steph Curry. Here's a slightly controversial opinion. Steph Curry might not actually be number 1 on this list. And the only reason for that is the sample size. He's played 28 games, and James Harden has played 35. And James Harden's three-point production in the season, it's pretty nuts. He's shooting nearly 11 threes a game, where he's shooting 39% from out there. Similar to Lou Williams, Harden is creating a lot of these himself. James Harden is by far and away the best pull-up three-point shooter in the NBA, this season at least. He's taking 8 pull-up threes a game. Basically all of his threes are pull-ups. Now Steph Curry is fantastic as well, as he takes about 4.5 pull-up threes a game, and both of these guys shoot around 40% in those situations. But is the sample size enough? Because Steph Curry, if he hadn't missed any time, then he'd be number 1, because he's Steph Curry, and that's just is what it is. And he has been otherworldly since he's come back from his injury, but he's hurt right now. So is this kind of a Joel Embiid situation, where we know who number 1 really is, but because he just hasn't been out there enough, does he kind of become the quote-unquote loser here just on a technicality? If you wanted to project forward, James Harden's going to be out until probably the end of January, so maybe that pushes Steph Curry number 1. These two are clearly number 1 and 2. They're both taking double-digit threes, and they're both shooting around 40%, which is just insane. But maybe the fact that Harden's played 7 more games than Steph Curry puts him number 1. I don't know. I don't think there's a wrong answer here, but I do think that James Harden and Steph Curry are clearly number 1 and 2, and personally, I think I would give the edge to Harden.